The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." From the book of Job.
John, could you remind facilities to adjust these screens down a little for the afternoon session? Thank you. I see we're a full house today. I just want to make it clear to all that, especially considering the nature of this case, what my own policy tends to be concerning unnecessary interruptions or outbursts, or things of that nature, which is not super tolerant. So please, let's not have me at any point exercise my prerogative to clear the courtroom. Okay, Mr. Fransicum, we can begin.
May it please the court. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Richard Fransicum. My task is to act on behalf of the families of Simone Lapra and Jonathan Lilly in this case, and convince you through the evidence that the defendants bear legally significant fault in their deaths and should thus be found liable for compensatory damages. I've put the faces of the victims on the screen to your left. Here we see Simone Lapra and John Lilly. They were strangers to each other. He was 41 when he died, and she was just 20. Two lives ended senselessly and needlessly on the same night, in the same remote, snowy field. I've thought for a long time about how to prepare you for the strange and disturbing facts of this case. Naturally, it's been impossible, given the publicity of it all since 2020, to enter your responsibility here with no knowledge of it. But truly preparing you simply can't be done. What you'll hear in this courtroom over the days will seem completely impossible to you. This is why I'm asking all of you to keep in mind that no matter what you hear, no matter how it may shake or confuse you, your only job is very specific and clear. To judge not who the actual killers in this case were, because that we do not know, but rather who it was who condemned the victims to be in the exact spot where the assailants plunged knives into their bodies on that night 3.5 years ago. I hope to prove to you that it was the recklessness, cynicism, and deception demonstrated by the defendants that truly trapped John Lilly and Simone Lapra in that field to die. For this all to make sense, we have to start at the beginning. I want you to imagine you're in the shoes of John Lilly in November of 2020. John was a working man with a spotless employment record. After being honorably discharged from the United States Marines in 2008, he went to work in private security. A long-term contract job ended in May of 2019, and he eventually applied for an unadvertised position in that field, one he was notified of by an employment security services agency called Landover Staffing. But when they sent him for an interview with the employer, he was in for a bit of a surprise. Two representatives of St. Anselm Church in the hamlet of West Saugerties, New York, spoke to him in a small office beside the rectory. Those men were the defendants you see sitting behind that table on the far side of the room. Father Charles Novak and Vicar General Paul Land. Now, after major stomach surgery and a slow recovery, John Lilly had less than $2,000 in savings at that moment, and he wasn't in much position to turn down a job, so he listened carefully to what was offered. The job would be to provide armed protection to one person, virtually around the clock, for a period of not more than 60 days, and perhaps less if other arrangements were made, though he would be paid for the full 60. But other details and other requirements came to light. First, he would have to live that entire time in a converted shed, in a place these men preferred not to reveal to him until just a day prior to the beginning of his assignment. Second, he could reveal to absolutely no one where he would be spending those 30 to 60 days, or the identity of this mysterious client. Such was the importance of secrecy, they told him. So, imagine you're John Lilly, anxious for money to pay off a medical debt and keep up on your mortgage. 30 to 60 days doing something fairly simple that you've been trained to do well, for enough pay to buy you a few months of calm about your financial state. The defendants had their man. Father Novak picked him up from his home himself the very next week, drove him 45 minutes to West Saugerties, and when they arrived in a field by the eastern edge of the Indian Head Wilderness, the deceptions you'll hear detailed in our evidence continued. Oh, they intended to pay him. They fully intended to honor their financial contract with him. But they never told him what sort of danger he may have been in from day one, or how ill prepared they were to protect this protector. On the screen now are photographs of the remote property where John worked and slept and lived for just 18 days before he was killed. Here's pretty little St. Anselm Church lying at the end of a long, winding country lane in the corner of a field. Sort of quaint, right? Except the building had been abandoned after a flood in June of 2019, and no church services had been performed there since, while it was being restructured. No activities at all. You can begin to understand what John's disorientation might have been like, seeing the density of the forest, the hills in the distance, and the minimal structures open to him. These were his living quarters right here. This was essentially a storage shed where John was given one weapon for defense: a 410 gauge shotgun owned privately by Vicar General Paul Land. And across the big patch of grass here, another tiny dwelling. Strangely, he was asked not to get too close to it unless absolutely necessary, even though that was the place in which the person he was protecting lived. This was Simone Lapra. John's job was to make sure no one approached her shack, aside from one nun who brought her food and did her laundry. Simone herself would never leave this shack during those 18 days. Even if John had wanted to leave this place, it wasn't easy on foot. He had no car with him. It was 8 miles to Woodstock, the nearest town of any substantial size, where that same nun, Sister Elizabeth Clay, did his meager grocery shopping for him. So he did what he had to do. He patrolled the acreage, he watched, he listened. But he never really knew who or what it was he was watching for. Again, the defendants would not reveal everything they knew or suspected. Finally, toward the end of those 18 days, John did receive one very important piece of information from Simone herself. Though they had never spoken, not one time, she felt compelled to hand him a note out her window. The only time they'd ever had contact, these two strangers. You'll hear the contents of this note during these proceedings and see young Simone's handwriting. Despite the chilling contents of the note, which was a warning to John to leave for his own good, to get out of there as soon as possible, John Lilly stayed. And he was murdered because of this commitment to his duty. The night of December 5th was terribly cold, under 20 degrees, windy. 3 inches of snow had been forecast for most of Ulster County, and that turned into more. Sunset was at 5:01 p.m. John was responsible enough to keep an orderly log throughout that time, mostly out of work habit. And from it, we know that he set out for a second evening patrol of the acreage at about 8:30, in the dark, on foot, as always. He would have started by walking a wide oval around Simone's shack, maybe seeing a tiny light on in there, maybe not. Then he would have headed along the tree line to the west and curved around to the north. Father Novak once found him and spoke to him in the woods beside Plattekill Creek. So we know from that and John's notes that he went deep into them on occasion. By 9 o'clock, there were about 4 inches of snow measured at nearby Napping House Farm. And the evidence, including many unexpected prints left in the snow, shows that at some point in the night, someone, perhaps on horseback, came out of those woods with murderous intent. After some chaotic maneuvering in that snow, which left inscrutable traces, John got off 4 shots from his borrowed shotgun, with the shells found spread over a 30-yard area close to his hovel. We do not know who or what he was shooting at, or what he saw, or what he heard. He never got to make a final entry into that log. It's now my unfortunate obligation, I feel, to show you these images of the crime scene. Sadly, these will not be the most explicit ones you'll be seeing as part of the task before you. Here we see John Lilly lying dead in the bloodied snow many hours after his murder. Father Novak didn't discover the scene until almost 7:30 the next morning, having been sleeping safely all night in his own bed in Glasgow, miles away. Sister Elizabeth was the one who found the bodies. And here John is again. And this is Simone Lapra, dead inside her shack. And again. Between them, 91 stab wounds. We remain frustrated to this day that the killers who did this have not been identified or apprehended even after 3.5 years. And so that leaves the families of John and Simone only with a different means of achieving some closure, of addressing a version of guilt or innocence in this case. In a civil trial, we do not need to prove the defendants are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. We only need to convince you that the preponderance of the evidence shows they are liable in the deaths of these two completely innocent people. Liable for leaving them there to die when the evidence will tell us they knew it might happen. In particular, we will focus on the pressure we believe young Simone felt from older figures in her church to live a life that ended in premature death. I will leave things here for now because there's so much to come. Let me just stress one last time your true challenge, which is to separate the bizarre facts that will be presented from the core purpose of this trial, which is to answer just one question. Would the victims have become victims were it not for the decisions of these two defendants? Thank you.
Is defense counsel ready to address the jury at this time?
Yes, Your Honor. In the interest of fairness, could we remove that image before I begin my presentation?
Mr. Fransicum?
Yes.
Please just watch the wire, sir.
May it please the court. Good morning, all. My name is Jessica Holt-Ivers. I represent the defendants in this case, Father Charles Novak and Vicar General Paul Land, and I intend to present evidence affirming their innocence of any wrongdoing in this civil matter. If you turn your attention to the other screen there, I have someone else to show you, though it has to be only an artist's rendering. You are looking at a woman named Juliana of Norwich. She lived during the Middle Ages, 700 years ago in England. In her life, she witnessed the Black Plague and the Great Peasants' Revolt. She was what is known as an anchoress, a term which did not much survive past the time of Henry VIII. An anchoress was a person who had taken a holy vow to live in a permanent isolation from society and observe a strict routine of prayer and religious observance. It was a fairly rare phenomenon in the time of Juliana, but common enough to develop its own specific traditions. Juliana herself lived in a kind of cell attached to a church for most of her life. She had retreated there after receiving powerful visions of the Passion of Christ in the year 1373. She chose to devote her life to receiving such visions and writing about them. All the while, she never truly left her anchorhold. History tells us that the rites for the dead may have even been spoken as she entered her cell to signify her death to the physical world and rebirth to a life of spirituality and complete devotion to God. Today, she is seen as one of the most important Christian theologians and mystics in all of recorded history, and one of the first women to have her writings published. In her own time, her community would have revered her and looked to her as a model of piety and hope. And now, here on the screen again is Simone Lapra, seen at age 19 in Thargomindah, Queensland, Australia with her family. As unlikely as it seems in this day and age, this intelligent, independent young woman made a choice similar to the one made so long ago by Juliana of Norwich. She herself had been gifted with strange and wondrous visions from the time she was 8 years old, when she, like Juliana, suffered and recovered from a powerful physical illness. And like Juliana, she wrote of her visions. Her parents were proud of her piety, her writing ability, and her extraordinary academic curiosity. At 17, she wrote a monograph called 3 Paradoxes of Christian Judgment. It was published by Loyola College in Melbourne. By 18, she had done as much specific research on the anchorites than perhaps anyone her age ever had. And at 19, she made a bold choice to live as one. I use the word choice very carefully here and with purpose. I don't want you to forget that word. During this trial, you will see many documents proving that Simone Lapra very much wanted to follow in the footsteps of Juliana of Norwich and became a true anchoress. No one forced her into this life, and you will see through her many writings how smart and determined she was to give herself to the church's needs. From 2011 to 2020, she produced more than 3,000 pages of theological writing and personal diaries. The defendants in this case, Father Novak and Vicar General Land, volunteered the use of a quiet, scenic property adjacent to St. Anselm Church in West Saugerties for her wishes. Why here in the state of New York, thousands of miles from her home country? Because in several of the visions she received between 2016 and 2019, many of which you will learn in some detail, she vividly saw that place and saw herself there for reasons even she herself did not know. 3 times in her diary, she described the specifics of a location she had never known, believing fate and God were putting her there. She would come to St. Anselm for 11 months, living in her little cottage with her beloved cat, Pebble, and visited daily by Sister Elizabeth, who will testify for you about how Simone's traditional living needs were met with care and consideration, including bringing her dozens and dozens of books for her theological research. Yes, that was Simone who John Lilly was hired to guard in November of 2020. But why, you might be wondering, would an anchoress possibly need armed protection? You have already heard some fairly amazing truths here today, some very unlikely ones, but as the prosecutor has pointed out, ladies and gentlemen, we are in extraordinary territory here. You need to know that the spiritual visions of Simone Lapra were not often pleasant ones. In her dreams and in the waking trances she trained herself to enter, she sometimes saw things and heard things which were alarming both to her and to the defendants who committed to work with her in her scholarship. Unlike Juliana of Norwich, she did not behold the sufferings or the glories of Christ, or receive glowing visions of shining kingdoms, or come to understand a better way of living on earth. No. Unlike any other anchoress that history has managed to record, Simone Lapra withstood mental visitations by something dark and terrifying. Essentially, out there in her cottage, roughly every 20 to 25 days, she witnessed, in her senses, her mind, her heart, what she and the defendants came to believe were the movements and intentions of Christ's cruel opposite. Here, yes, we are speaking of Satan. The defendants you see here in the courtroom with the approval of the oratory of Augustine in the city of Cairns, Queensland, worked with her cautiously and carefully ever since the first of these later visions came to her at the age of 16. Together they tried to understand the unusual nature of Simone's gift and encouraged her to translate her impressions to the page. You'll be asked in court to read some of these pages and hopefully again be impressed by Simone's clarity and intellect. For her privacy and out of respect for her, these intense studies were kept as private as possible. Fire, cataclysm, violence, death. Yes, Simone saw these things in her vision sometimes, but mostly they were far more cryptic and somehow even more disturbing. She came to believe that she was seeing the devil move among us in a very specific, tangible, human form. She wrote of her growing conviction that she was coming to know in her heart when it was that Satan had become personified, just as the Christian Savior once became personified. 1996 was the year Simone believed Satan began to walk freely among humankind. In her late teens, she believed she was beginning to perceive his movements and even coming to suspect his geographical location. Impossible. Absurd. This is what you may be thinking, but this thinking underestimates the power of religious faith. More importantly, whether what Simone saw was true or not is irrelevant to the proceedings here. The fact is, the evidence will show that she and others believed wholeheartedly in their mission. Even Sister Elizabeth herself was part of the effort to encourage Simone's work while protecting the privacy she needed. And in September of 2020, when Simone and the defendants began to feel that something enigmatic was approaching that small town in New York State with the purpose of confronting Simone herself, the defendants immediately did an unusually responsible thing. They turned to a professional to temporarily protect her. They did not try to go it alone. Despite there being no direct, stated threat to Simone, despite them not even really knowing what might be out there, they acted out of an abundance of caution and took steps. They didn't even initially know how to go about finding a protector, but they did their best with what they knew. Trying to describe to John Lilly the nature of Simone's studies would have been not just difficult, but completely unpragmatic. When, on December 2nd, 3 days before the deaths of the victims, Simone reached through her window to hand John a note of warning that something might be coming to harm them both, he made his own choice. He chose to stay and keep protecting her as he had agreed to do, as he was paid to do. Simone, meanwhile, took not a single step outside her home, free to go as always, but intent on obeying the spiritual path she had created for herself. What happened on December 5th and why remains a mystery to all of us, a frustrating, maddening mystery, but it is not because of anything the defendants did that horror came to that field. They have never been charged with anything in criminal court, and no one has asserted that they had any knowledge of what happened that night until Sister Elizabeth called them upon coming to Simone's cottage at dawn. In fact, the evidence will show that it is Landover staffing that failed to establish proper protections and divulgences in their handling of John Lilly's employment and bear more of the responsibility for his own plight than do the defendants. I ask you to put aside your preconceptions of God and the devil and religious worship and instead honor Simone Lapra for her courage and dedication and acknowledge that at no point was she a prisoner of the church or anyone else. She was free to leave her home in St. Anselm any time she chose. And in fact, she traveled voluntarily twice with Sister Elizabeth between April and August to receive dental treatment right here in the city of Kingston. The evidence will also show that no one but the murderers are truly to blame for the tragic way Simone Lapra and John Lilly died. One day soon, hopefully the perpetrators of these crimes will be found and brought to justice, and we will finally have the explanations we want so badly. We do not even today understand fully, after 3.5 years, the exact nature of the weapons used to commit the murders, or the nature of the animals that seem to have carried the assailants to the church property that night, then carried them away again, back into the woods. Sometimes in this life, though, there are no firm explanations. and there is no one to rationally punish when tragedy strikes. Do not punish these men for their beliefs. Do not punish these men for a failure to imagine the unimaginable. Do not punish these men for trying to protect Simone Lapra or for employing John Lilly through completely legal and transparent means. This is a horror story, ladies and gentlemen, and I do not envy you having to hear and see its details. But we must be rational and fair when all around us seems otherwise. That is how we respect Simone Lapra and John Lilly. Thank you.
I had never actually listened to this recording until I found myself back in Kingston this July for a symposium on the Simone Lapra case, 8 years after that day in court. Also in attendance at the symposium was Jessica Holt-Ivers, now just Jessica Holt. We talked a bit, and were friendly enough for me to recall to her how cocky I felt back then when listening to her give her opening statement. How confident that I was the more rehearsed, the more self-assured on my feet, the more easygoing and relatable to the jury in my own presentation. But of course, you never really know. She expressed a casual interest in driving back to the church property in West Socrates before she headed back to the airport, and I agreed that seemed like a good idea. So we both went. It was good that I had four-wheel drive, because the dirt lane leading to St. Anselm's was thick with crisscrossing foliage now. The entire acreage had been left to go back to nature after the church itself was torn down in 2026. Also gone were the two other buildings that had played central roles in the case. Now there was just a rolling field, ever more covered by wild grasses and buzzing thatches of overgrowth. We got out and walked around just a little bit, quiet in our own thoughts. The afternoon light was a comforting gold and yellow. I couldn't help but look off toward the deeper woods that led into the Indian Head wilderness. When we were about to leave, Miss Holt pointed something out to me I had somehow missed. 3 unpainted wooden birdhouses had been affixed to short posts some time before, making a geographical triangle over a wide area. And from our individual memories of going out there for trial prep 8 years before, we figured out that each post now marked an important spot. Where the front door of St. Anselm's had once been, sparrows now walked the tiny ledge of one of those birdhouses. Where John Lilly had lived in what I'd cynically referred to as a shed in court, I saw a single goldfinch perched atop the second birdhouse, head turning this way and that to survey the afternoon. And dark brown and blue birds I didn't know the names of pleasantly populated the third house, in whose spot a window had once become so thickly streaked with snow and blood that for hours it could be neither opened wider nor closed forever.